Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
This week on the podcast, we're delighted to have Oliver Burkeman as our guest. He's the author of the new book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. His previous book is The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. Oliver has been a columnist with The Guardian, where he wrote a column for many years entitled, "This Column Will Change Your Life." And his writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other media outlets. The book will be available on August 10th in the United States and on August 26th in the UK. And his website is oliverburkeman.com, and we'll put that in the show notes. We're going to be talking today about time. Since his new book is on time management, we're going to circumambulate the topic from a Jungian view, which is, I think, very consonant with the way you formulate this, Oliver, in your book. And I know in your thinking, Oliver has been a longtime fan of the podcast, so we're thrilled to have him with us. So why don't you just start by telling us what made you write the book?
I feel like there are so many layered answers to the question because, on some level, my book writing has always emerged from the columns I've been writing and the ideas that have been sort of coming to the surface most often through that sort of weekly rhythm of column writing. But the other thing that's incredibly obvious to me is that I only seem to write books about things that I really struggle with personally. And this one, being about limitation and finitude and what it means to try to actually face up to the facts of our limited time and how we go wrong in trying to feel unlimited. That sort of arose completely from personal experience. I think it became clear to me after a while writing the newspaper column, for example, that a lot of my sort of explorations in ways of being productive and organized and getting things done and sort of restructuring your to-do list in a million different exciting and innovative ways, that they were always leading me to feel like I was just on the verge of being in perfect control of things and with no need to feel insecure about career or finances or even relationships, but I never actually got there. And I describe in the book having a sort of an epiphany on a bench in Brooklyn, here where I live, on a winter morning a few years ago, of just like, oh, hang on, like none of this is ever going to work. Like none of this is ever going to catapult me through over the wall here from feeling overwhelmed or out of control or anxious into this kind of sense of having got one's life into working order. And so that was the beginning of really trying to make sense of the subject. I suppose I wouldn't pretend that at that moment I knew that what I was dealing with was fundamentally about limitation or finitude, but turns out it was.
Well, you understood in that moment, it seems, and this is very much the theme of the book, that the effort to gain control of time is a move away from accepting finitude and the fundamental fact that there's so much that we can't control in life.
Right, exactly that. I sort of divided up in my mind and in the book into the ways in which we're limited through our limited quantity of time, and that title 4,000 weeks refers to the approximate length of an 80-year lifespan, and then all the kind of subtler ways in which we crave this sense of control over how things are going to unfold and can't have it, right? Because we are sort of fundamentally vulnerable to events, and in any moment anything at all could happen. And it's been very interesting finishing this book during the pandemic. It didn't, it began a long time before that, but to sort of understand, as I think people increasingly do, maybe not that we're living through uniquely uncertain times, but that we're sort of seeing something true about the amount of control that we always don't have over time and over how things happen. It's just that, there are other points in history where it's maybe been easier to convince ourselves otherwise. Although not many. I mean, I think possibly the comforting, secure times we all always remember from a while ago are sort of few and far between, or based around the fact that we're young at the time.
I find myself sitting in this question, what the difference is between control and creativity. That we have an hour, and we can come to it with any number of different attitudes. If we're seeking to control the hour, then there's also a sense of who the enemy is. Being out of control, being anxious, or being remorseful that there's a sense of waste at the end of the hour. We could also take that same hour and come to it with a determination to create something, which also establishes certain kinds of limits within that hour. And so it seems to be two sides of a coin to me.
It's really interesting to me because I think, in the first case, there's something to do with the idea of time as, you said something similar, time as an enemy, time as an adversary, and the job is to sort of win the battle with time by getting done the things that you're determined to get done, or bringing into being what you are determined to bring into being. But the second case is not just sitting there and waiting for inspiration to bubble up either, right? The second case, the creating case, is a matter of taking initiative, but not in this condition of seeing time as the adversary or as something you're finally going to defeat.
Creativity has something to do with desire, that something is appealing, something is beckoning, something is calling me, whether it's something inside of myself that wants to be brought forward into the outer world, or some creative effect that we want on the environment. But there's a kind of engine of desire, because I think desire is at the base of what human personality is. We're libidinous machines, versus control, which feels reactive to me and feels less driven by desire and more driven by fear. Whether it's fear of loss or fear of shame because I didn't use the time in the way that I thought I should, or fear that life will become out of control and then some kind of disastrous thing will occur because I wasn't vigilant enough.
Yeah, I'm feeling into that, and I'm wanting to maybe peg it to some curiosities that I have about you, Oliver, because I don't really know what it's like to be a journalist, but I can imagine that deadlines loom large. I think what Joseph is saying is that sense that there's sort of a to-do list and we're answerable to something outside of us in some way, whether that's actual because we have a boss or a deadline or, a time we have to submit something by, versus an inner urge to do something that really wells up from the deeper parts of the personality that kind of grabs hold of us and says, sit down, get your butt in the chair and write this because your soul needs you to write this, and how those two things might cause us to experience time differently. And I wonder, is that something that you can relate to?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about why I was so drawn for so many years to a job that was completely structured around deadlines and just that word deadline. Yeah, you do. I think I was then definitely a lot of the time in a mindset that like this was a fight to the death, and these things absolutely had to be forced into the available time, and not just so that the newspaper wouldn't have a blank space in it, which in fact it never would because they have ways of being ready for that eventuality, but so that I was sort of justifying my existence on the planet.
Yes.
And I think that's, I mean, we could go into great depth, I'm sure, about that, but I think that is sort of, fundamentally in miniature, that's a sort of 1 day or example, or 1 week example of this sort of bigger notion that at some point you're going to be sort of standing victorious over time. You're going to be able to handle anything that's thrown at you. You're going to be able to put into practice all the ambitions that you had for your life, and you won't have to be letting anybody down. No one's going to be angry with you for missing some deadline, dropping the ball. And really where I start off in this book is just like, there's a math problem with that before you go any further, right? I mean, if time is finite and the number of things you can feel you want to do, or that other people can ask you to do, or that you can have been raised to feel it's your obligation to do, if they're all infinite, or effectively infinite, there's a problem here that has to be faced at some point. Or you can do what I think a lot of people do instead, which is try to convince themselves that they are, and I did for many years certainly, which is to convince themselves that through just the right method of time management or a bit more self-discipline, next week, next month, next year, they might finally be in that position.
I'm thinking about this from sort of a point of view of ego versus something else, the something else that allows us to drop down and drop into a kind of timeless space and find that sort of still point of the turning world, versus our so-called rational and cognitive capacities that deceive us into thinking that doing things and pleasing people and getting through our to-do list, that's the priority, and that it's just not true. And that's a hard truth to face, isn't it? Partly it's true. If we don't pay the mortgage, there will be a big consequence for that. But giving it such prominence as if it is the reality is the falsehood.
I think for me, I don't know how much this is the sort of universal situation, but it's to do with relating or not relating, right? In some way, that the relationship with time that is one that acknowledges its limitations is one that involves sort of being in a kind of relationship with reality, with other people and their influence over how your time unfolds, with other parts of your own personality beyond the ego that may want certain things that you don't think you want. And there's something I see now about that very control-focused approach, which is sort of anti-relational in a way. It's like, it's about sort of not giving yourself fully to the reality in which you find yourself. And I think that's helps explain things like why the sort of forms of distraction that we see from the reality that we're in, right? I talk in the book about the specific sort of phenomenology of being online on social media or whatever, the feeling of being the god of your little world and of being sort of unbound by distance. You can be anyone you want. You can find out what's happening any number of thousands of miles away immediately with no pause. And that kind of, there's something in all that connectivity that is that sort of digital connectivity that is extremely kind of solitary and is about sort of not going through the discomfort of actually sort of being in relationship with not just other people, but other parts of you and time.
Well, I think anytime that we're caught in an inflated fantasy, which I think of as a kind of mercurial fantasy, Mercury was the god of travel, and he could kind of instantaneously be one place and another place and deliver messages here and there. But the quality that Mercury had is that he was always unaffected by where he was, which granted him this ability to go to the depths of Tartarus and up to Mount Olympus with this kind of impunity. And it seems when we're talking about this limitless mercurial world, people also are seduced into this idea that they're unaffected or can't be affected, or there are no consequences for themselves moving with this rapidity.
Right. It reminds me of that strange phenomenon where it seems so much more, impatience seems to be triggered so much more by, in a world of time-saving technologies, right? It's much more, it makes you much more, it's much harder to wait a minute for the microwave than 2 hours for the oven. And the explanation I sort of have explored for that is this idea that these technologies seem to bring us right to the very cusp of being able to act with zero pushback from reality, no stubbornness from things, to be able to cook food in no time at all. And therefore, the fact that it still takes 2 minutes is much more of a sort of insult to our fantasies than.
Oh, I really like that framing. I'm actually still back at what you said a few minutes ago, the way you framed it, that there's a math problem, that the demands on us from the culture, from our parents, from our jobs, from these outside influences are limitless, and yet our time is not. And so what are you going to do about that? And so it seems that the acceptance of finitude, understanding really that our time is limited, understanding that and metabolizing the implications of that, it's a real demand to claim our values, ourselves, what really matters.
Yeah, I love that. Metabolizing it is the thing, and also speaks to the fact that, it's an incredibly gradual process that I have probably myself only just begun. It doesn't feel good at first. And this is kind of I think this was a big mystery to me for many years, right? The fact that it's really strange that the things that you value the most in life, that like doing them so often makes you feel like you want to procrastinate on them or distract yourself, or they feel boring. Like, that makes no sense until you start thinking about the fact that actually every time you're doing something like that and committing to something like that, you are facing this math problem instead of trying to find ways to avoid facing it. And there's a quote from Charlotte Jocko Beck, the late American Zen Buddhist teacher, which I actually use in the very beginning of the book, which I really love, which is, I think she's talking about life in general. What makes it unbearable is your mistaken belief that it can be cured.
I read that in the book, and it was just like, yeah, I think that's so true of so many things.
Like how many of what we call our problems in life are a kind of objection to the fact that problems ought to be thrown up by our finitude and limitation rather than the problems themselves. How bad would limitation feel if we could somehow get past the demand that things not be that way?
It comes down to really taking in, as we talk here today, about accepting the what is. This is what is in all kinds of ways. Our limitations. My plans just went all haywire because trees fell over on the road and I can't get there from here. How really hard that is to do. And I'm thinking about the quote from Jung that I won't get quite right about. He said that whatever got in the way of his desires and ego and will was what he called God.
There are some strains of thought that say that time is a manifestation of the deity. Time is God in a certain sense. It is that matrix in which we unfold, but it contains us and delimits us. And if we're really going to be here, then we have to accept that limitation.
I don't just want to throw quotes at you, but also there's a phrase that always sums this up for me so perfectly from Anthony de Mello, the sort of Catholic spiritual writer, who defines spiritual enlightenment as absolute cooperation with the inevitable. And I think that's the aspiration here, right? The absolute cooperation, which speaks to the idea that it's a relationship. But also, I can also hear, because people do bring this up very readily, I think, I can hear people objecting that you've got to be sure that what you're dealing with is really inevitable. Otherwise, this becomes a sort of manifesto for passivity and quietism and not trying to change your life or the social situation of the world or fighting injustice. It's not about assuming that more things are unchangeable than might actually be the case.
I think about this a lot because I think exactly what you're talking about is an issue that trips a lot of us up in our lives and brings a lot of people into the consulting room, which is people are sometimes struggling to change things that they really can't change. They're fighting against the inevitable. Or sometimes they've collapsed and are not doing the things that they could do to change things. And both of these are sort of maladaptive attitudes. And how do we come into the right relationship with those things? And, I think about the serenity prayer in AA, which is God, give me the courage to change the things that I can change, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Right.
That's pretty profound. That's a pretty profound prescription when you really think about it. That applies to so much. How do we go about accepting what really can't be changed? And where do we find the courage to make the changes that we can? And how do we know what's one and what's the other? So much of life is wrapped up in that.
Oliver, something is just kind of coming up in the back of my mind. And I'm thinking about a group of new kinds of clients that have come into my practice. And they are these really high-performing, impressive young Turks, that are taking life, by the throat and really wringing out everything that they want from it. And they're often using this term of optimization. How do you optimize every moment, optimize your body, optimize the way you're thinking? This arc of constant self-improvement and improvement of every moment. And that somehow seems to be related to people's perception of time as well.
Yeah, totally. And I do, in this book, engage in a little bit of ranting about that aspect of self-help culture and popular psychology. I think, I mean, for some definition of the word optimization, perhaps it's a perfectly sort of unproblematic goal, but I think what it means and has come to mean in practice today is this sort of perpetual attempt to get better and better and better in so many domains and to such a great degree that it is explicitly what we've been talking about, right? It is an attempt to become superhuman in a way that is obviously actually closed to us. And one of the things that I talk about at some length in the book is it's not, maybe the most important point about that is that it's just a very anxious way to live that sort of defines where you are right now as perpetually inadequate and not enough. Maybe that's the most important thing. But the other thing is it's not even a very good way to get useful things done on the level of the day or to launch the projects that you're so excited about, because various traps involved with becoming more efficient that go all the way back to Parkinson's law, right? The idea that work expands to fill the time available for its completion, right?
Boy, does it ever.
If you get, I know this from personal experience, if you get really, really good at processing your email, because being the sort of optimal processor of email is one of your goals, all that happens is you just get lots more email because Firstly,
people write back.
People write back, and then you have to reply to them. Yeah, exactly. You get a reputation as being someone who's worth emailing because they'll be responsive instead of the people who you never bother because you know it's going to be a month before you hear from them, if at all. And if you sort of generalize this to, let's say, a working life as a whole, I think it goes way beyond that too. But any new incoming opportunity or request is never going to be properly evaluated as whether it is something that should take a portion of your finite time, because you're going to have this notion that you can do everything. And what naturally happens then is that the meaningless stuff begins to overtake the meaningful stuff, because there's no editing or selection mechanism. In the words of there's a management writer called Jim Benson, who I quote here and there, who says that, you become you become a bottomless reservoir of other people's expectations, right? Because you're setting up a machine for not being discerning about what comes into your life. And sort of to answer an objection that might be hanging around in some people's minds, absolutely the most important thing for a given person in a given situation might be to be very responsive to emails that they consider to be BS, because that is just the job that they find themselves in, and it's the right thing for them to do at this point is to meet the demands of that job, right? So it's not always a recipe for walking out of the door and launching a bungee jumping company in New Zealand or something, but it's to do with sort of consciously choosing what you do, even if that involves choosing things that in an ideal world you wouldn't have to be doing. It's an internal psychological decision not to collaborate with the impossible demands that are being placed on you, right? So if you're unfortunate enough to be in a position where just keeping a roof over your head feels like it means doing the impossible, at least you cannot kid yourself that happiness lies in some way of finally managing to do the impossible, like next month or next year. You can sort of secede from that ideology.
Yeah, I like your point very much about at least don't collaborate with, signing off on the belief that this is what makes life meaningful. If you have to do certain things, then you have to do certain things. But we don't have to abandon ourselves to that. And I liked the phrase from Marilyn Robinson that you quote in the book about joyless urgency.
Right.
Around all the stuff, the to-do lists and so on. And that might be a good place for people to check in with themselves of how am I doing? How am I feeling? Where is the life in me as I lead my life? And is it joyless? And that could be a real signal that something's off.
I'm also thinking about this fantasy that's woven into capitalism in general, and particularly capitalism as it's practiced in the United States at the moment, that human resources can be infinitely stressed because it will make them infinitely creatively responsive. So one person is now doing the job of 2 people or 3 people, and if they haven't died of a heart attack or our profit line seems to continue to grow, obviously we've underappreciated the fact that people could do the jobs of 4 people each. And it's really not until workers allow a system to fall apart or to show symptoms of failure that anything is likely to change, which goes, I think, to your idea, Oliver, that people have to abdicate their collaboration with some of these paradigms and to refuse to collaborate, as you said, with impossible demands, or else the system just keeps humming along.
That also puts me in mind of another aspect of this. I mean, it's totally implicit in some of what you've been saying as well, but that you can think of capitalism in some ways, I think, as a sort of giant machine for instrumentalizing everything, right? For taking natural resources, for taking people's time, for taking people's ingenuity and using it to try to get something out of it. And in and of itself, I don't think that's necessarily wrong with that inherently. But it does lead to this other emphasis that I have written about, where this kind of fixation on using time well, almost regardless of whether you think you're using it well for financial profit or using it well for some much more sort of high-flown goal, it sort of leads inevitably to this notion that the only value of the present moment is for its service to some future goal. And then you sort of aren't ever living, because every moment of your time is for some other time. There's a Catholic legal scholar who, a quote called Kathleen Kavanagh, who's written fascinating stuff about what the convention of the billable hour does to the spirits of especially sort of corporate lawyers. This idea that every hour of your life must be turned into a commodifiable product that can then be sort of sold to the client, and that it leads to this notion that we sometimes maybe confuse with busyness, which is sort of not being able to value time that can't be instrumentalized in that way. So she says, when the sort of overstressed corporate lawyer can't find time to show up to his child's school performance or something, it may not be because in the sort of conventional sense they have just too many items on the to-do list. It may be that they're sort of lost some of the capacity to value that as something worth doing with your time, because it can't be instrumentalized in that way. I'm sure there are vast numbers of actual corporate lawyers who totally understand this. I don't mean to single out specific profession, but the idea that thinking about time as being useful for the future is sort of, there's something sort of malignant about it. It sort of ends up taking over everything about time.
You did a really interesting thing in the book about this, because you start off talking about how we didn't used to have a way of measuring time. And so it was just, you just did what was required in that moment. Say, if you were a European serf, it was, the sun was up, it was time to get up.
Right.
The sun goes down, it's time to go to bed. And, I looked up the etymology of time, and it's related to the word tide. So it's just this natural process of ebbing and flowing that we are just sort of comfortably embedded in until we can abstract it, and we have clock time and the ability to measure it in this precise way. And then it's so easily commodified.
Right. You have to be sort of alienated from it in the first place for any of these problems to arise, because I think that, and anthropologists call this task orientation, right? The idea that the only understanding some peoples at different points in history, and to some extent still today, have of time is the medium in which their life is unfolding, rather than this mental yardstick that your life is sort of running alongside and either keeping pace with, or you're letting it pass, too much of it's being wasted, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we all have experiences of being in that kind of task orientation, maybe from childhood, but maybe even today. I think it does happen.
I have this little story about when I was in high school. I went to a public high school, and our classes ended at very odd times. Our classes were like 53 minutes long or something. So, class would end at 9:47 or something, and then there'd be some time in the hall. So it was all these odd times, and I didn't wear a watch, and I didn't know what time the classes ended, because they all ended at weird times. And I remember becoming aware that the other people in class would start getting antsy and look at the clock at a certain point. And I realized that they all knew when the class ended and had been anticipating that and were tracking that. And at that point in my life, anyway, I was just able to sort of be there for that 53 minutes and be like, okay, for whatever amount of time I'm here until the bell rings, we're going to be talking about Macbeth, and it was lovely. And then at some point I started wearing a watch, and I figured out when the classes end, and, and I been like that ever since. It's like, okay, what's my next thing? I've got, 13 more minutes until the next thing, and then I've got to do this. And it was, I guess that was my rough equivalent to being a European serf, is that my life was controlled by the bell. But it was lovely not to have such an acute awareness of everything down to the minute, and to just sort of be present.
This takes me to the point that I think is worth lifting up, of that we all work on the clock.
Oh, yes.
There is an analytic hour, and we do have to pay attention to what the clock says. And yet, paradoxically, I think we strive in relation with the other person in the room to drop outside of time and to find a flow that feels in some way timeless and deep. And to hold those polarities is a really intrinsic part of what we do.
Yeah, that's a great point, Deb. I'm glad you brought that up.
I have found myself wondering if there's something liberating about the sort of relative lack of autonomy over one's time that one must have once you are a therapist with a full roster. I mean, it's like, as a freelance writer and doer of things, there's many, many days when I could just about stop at 1 p.m. and could just about keep going till 11 p.m., depending on how self-punishing and inadequate I was feeling. Now, obviously you do, as this podcast demonstrates, you're doing lots of other things with your time than your scheduled sessions. But there's something about the immovability of that I almost envy. It's just there.
Well, it is a kind of finitude. And there is, in a way, a kind of surrender at times to the limitations of the realities of our lives, that this is simply what is. That, in a way, I think can also throw into relief, highlight, and make more precious the timelessness of the time we do have together. As you point out in the book, if we had 40,000 weeks instead of 4,000, some of that urgency about that time matters and how we use our time matters would really evaporate or subside in some way. So it's both. It's a both and, that being aware of time can help us drop into a sort of timelessness.
It's bringing to my mind as well also this idea that the finitude is what gives any of this meaning, right? This idea that various different philosophers have considered over the centuries. I think that eternal life, as we commonly understand it anyway, would be hell. For nothing to be at stake about how you used a given moment of time would be almost the definition of a meaningless, a sort of ultimately meaningless life. And I quote the American philosopher Martin Hagland himself, quoting a headline from an American Catholic magazine, which is, "Heaven, will it be boring?" This sort of sudden dawning worry that if what heaven meant, and obviously many Christians don't have this understanding of it, but if what it meant was just, a limitless number of days,
playing your harp,
it would be absolutely terrible, because the answer to the question, should I do X with my day, will always be, doesn't matter.
I find myself thinking about the distinction between time as frame and then taking responsibility for content within that frame. So when I think about, my analytic week, and I have X number of hours, and I have a covenant with each of my analysands that we're going to both show up in this frame for 60 minutes on this day, it's the confidence that what happens in that frame is always different than what I would have expected, and therefore unique, unprecedented, surprising, not repetitive. I think that if people are attending to their own psychic life, the irrational and the unexpected are always present in the space, which has this strange effect of making the experience of time strangely mutable. How we can spend the 60 minutes with a client and then turn around and think, oh my gosh, 60 minutes just went by. Like, I don't know where that time went. Conversely, I might be with a client where it feels like every moment is dragging. And that 60 minutes feels like 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But inside the frame, it's very unpredictable as to what might happen, which I think is rather different from people who filled the frame with repetitive tasks. And this may have something to do with the idea of being excessively planning in one's day, that if one is predetermined what's going to happen in every frame, is it the planning that makes it feel dead or exhausting?
I have lots of sort of personal experience, I feel like, of trying to plan much too much and trying to sort of throw a frame around the future from the present and make it unfold, make the rest of the day unfold in a certain way. And I'm very familiar with that experience that on the one hand, things get in the way and you don't get to have life unfold according to your predetermined plans. But something that seems to me almost more important and profound, which is that when you do, it's no fun. When the days that it does go according to plan, something very, very central is missing from a day that is too planned in that regard. And I think the motivation for wanting to do it is just a sort of this same thing of wanting to feel in control, wanting to know what's coming down the pike. But it's very self-defeating in that sense, in that whenever it seems to work, it doesn't work because it drains the life from the day.
Yeah. You describe yourself in the book as a productivity junkie or something like that. I can't remember the word.
I say geek because that's what people say. Yeah.
Okay. So what are some of the techniques that you tried?
Oh, what are some of the techniques that I haven't tried? I mean, one of the sort of fortunate and also unfortunate things about writing a newspaper column about some of this stuff for so many years was that, one could try out everything under the guise that it was research for work. And this had some interesting, it worked in two different ways. One is that things like keeping a gratitude journal, that as a cynical British person, I might have considered far too excruciatingly embarrassing even to contemplate. You can do if you're doing it for work purposes, and you can find that actually they're right about that. It's unfortunately the Americans have a point when it comes to things like keeping gratitude journals. The other effect, the sort of less constructive and positive effect of that column, I think, was for me personally, was that it really served to enable this feeling that I was any day now going to find the technique that was going to make me sort of fully in control. And I think on some level also emotionally invulnerable. I think that's something else that's going on here. As for specific techniques, I mean, I have divided my to-do lists into A priorities, B priorities, and C priorities. I've divided my entire day into 15-minute portions and then 1 hour later completely forgotten about that plan. I've tried to sort of plan on a annual, monthly, weekly horizon. To a limited extent, I still do, but a lot of these techniques, I think it's not that they're a huge problem in themselves, that you can sort of bring them back into your life a bit later on once you see them for what they are. But when you're using them as this kind of, to keep climbing this ladder to this imaginary summit of control and security, that's when they really don't help.
And yet some people are making bank off of marketing these techniques, aren't they? I mean, there's a whole industry.
Oh, absolutely. And some of them I don't even think they shouldn't be, right? Because some of these things are completely kind of legitimate ways of getting a little bit of traction over the many, many things that come onto our plates. I think the problem, and definitely there are some personalities in this space who sort of feed this. Where is it all going? You know, what is it going to allow you to do? If it's going to allow you, if the promise is that it's going to allow you to be the master of your time. I mean, I there's a book title I quote there, just singling it out unfairly, but you know, master your time, master your life, which I think really sums up the thing I'm taking aim at here. That's a problem. But there are absolutely people talking about this material who are focused on the idea that a good time management technique helps you decide what to neglect and sort of steels you for the inevitability of the sacrifice that's going to be involved, or that already is involved, in fact, every day, but it's just a question of becoming more conscious of it.
I'm really grabbing hold of that word because I think it is so important, and it's very poignant that we are required to make a sacrifice of what is important and what is not important. And it's a humbling as well. But sacrifices, really vaults us into the archetypal realm.
Basically, anytime you say the word sacrifice around Jungians, we're going to jump on it.
Yeah. It's what do we sacrifice? Our belief in our ability to control and master and achieve and do, that we have to sacrifice some of that in order to live more meaningfully and find our own souls to some extent. All of these capitalist structures and self-help books and master your time, master your life are really asking us to sacrifice what we arrogate to ego and how we collude with external values, structures, etc.
So, Oliver, was there a particular process that you go through to decide what to neglect and then therefore what to sacrifice? What's your little evaluation process that works for you?
I mean, on a very, very moment-to-moment, day-to-day to-do list kind of level, I've found a huge amount of value in a variety of different techniques that all have in common this notion of limiting your work in progress, which is this idea of, the archetypal, not in your sense, the canonical version of this technique is like a kanban board. So you divide a piece of paper or a whiteboard into columns: to do, doing, done. You put tasks on post-its. None of this really matters in detail. The point is, you only allow 3 post-its into that doing column. You choose ways of managing what's on your plate that sort of bring you into this direct confrontation with the idea that you can only focus on so much at once. And then in this methodology, you don't allow a new task into that doing column until one has been moved out through being completed.
So I see that really as less a to-do type of function than a call to consciousness.
Right, exactly.
It's a way to see where my priorities for the day are. I like it very much as a way of creating a relationship between the external world and one's internal world.
I couldn't have put it better or even that well myself. No, that's exactly what I find, that this and that all the techniques that sort of work are the ones that gently take you by the hand and lead you into this confrontation instead of soothing you that you might never have to make it.
Well, so there's a couple things that are coming up for me. The first is with this idea of sacrificing and this confrontation is this idea that we have to accept finitude to kind of come into being. And I'm thinking of this. I was so excited that you used this particular quote from Marie-Louise von Franz, because I love this quote. And it's from her book, Puer Aeternus. That there is a strange attitude and feeling that one is not yet in real life. For the time being, one is doing this or that, But whether it is a relationship with a woman or a job, it is not yet what is really wanted. And there is always the fantasy that sometime in the future, the real thing will come about. The one thing dreaded throughout by such a type of man is to be bound to anything whatever. There is a terrific fear of being pinned down, of entering space and time completely, and of being the unique human that one is. That is what is asked of us, is to allow ourselves to be pinned down and to come into being completely in space and time. I love the way she puts that. And that requires this sacrifice that you're talking about. And your example is just a great way to kind of operationalize that. And as a culture, there is a fantasy that's promulgated of infinity, of infinite growth, for example, in the economic sphere, that we can just keep on doing, or as Joseph alluded to more, an individual can just keep on taking more and more work and is infinitely malleable and infinitely responsive. And it's a lovely fantasy, but but it's a fantasy. And to really live a full life, we have to give up that fantasy.
That quote about the provisional life, the Marie-Louise von France thing, totally just gives me goosebumps to this day to hear it, because it's I feel totally seen through.
You feel called out.
Several decades of young adulthood there, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's really in the culture. It's also an archetypal fantasy. I'm thinking about the myth of Gilgamesh, which is, I think it's the oldest myth that we have. And in the latter part of it, he's so distraught by the death of his friend that he undertakes this journey to discover the secret of eternal life. And he eventually finds it, but then falls asleep on his journey back with it, and it is stolen by the snake. And so he fails. It's not, you will never find it. It's always going to be just out of grasp. The issues that you're lifting up in your book are truly ancient and archetypal.
So time shows up in mythology in a lot of different ways, whether it's Kronos or Saturn. Sometimes it's wound into the archetype of the Great Mother, inasmuch as the mother is thought to bring spirit and the ephemeral into form, then birthing it, but also subjecting it to all the vicissitudes of life and decay and pain. And whether that's a creative project that is suddenly birthed and then subject to the criticism and critique of other people, which can be rather painful, and just the suffering that most people have, particularly introverts do, when the internal object is extroverted and subject to the outer world, is an ambivalent process. So I can imagine that influences how people relate to limits and the production of things.
Yes, totally. I think that sort of sense that something is lost in bringing something into the world, but on the other hand, it can't have any meaning unless it is brought into the world is so powerful. It's the appeal of procrastination and why it's so alluring to hold back on from starting or from making progress on things that you really care about, leading to this very perverse situation where you can be, as I was for many years, incredibly efficient and productive as long as it's things that don't really matter to me. This notion that that bringing something into the world is sort of inevitably to subject it to the ravages of time and decay. There's a philosopher I quote called Kostika Bradatan who illustrates this by means of a fable. I think it's his own fable about a Persian architect who designed the world's most beautiful mosque. So perfect in its proportions that everyone wanted to, builders from around the world wanted to be given the privilege of building it, and people came to his doorstep to sort of just admire the plans. And then, anyway, the end of this tale is that he locks himself in his study with the plans for 3 days and nights and then burns them, because to bring them into reality would be to ruin them, because then it would be real, and then it couldn't be perfect. Things would go wrong in the construction. Time would cause the building to, and I think actually Brereton connects that to Gnostic spirituality, which I do not understand. Maybe you do, but this sort of idea that on some level material reality is a kind of a mistake, or a degradation, a degradation and a devolution. But on the other hand, it's all we have.
Yes. On the other hand, it's all we have. And that brings up for me other cultural and philosophical strains that celebrate that. In Japanese aesthetics, there's this love for the thing which is imperfect, and there's the love for the thing which is impermanent, which is part of the significance of the cherry blossoms, is they're so beautiful and they just last a few days.
Yeah, that's such a good example of like absolute cooperation with the inevitable, right? I mean,
you have these wonderful questions at the end of the book, 5 questions, and I'm thinking that maybe we can have you read those out and we can discuss them as a way of summing up our discussion today.
Happily, yeah. And I say at the beginning of this passage that, it's not that there's some specific answer necessarily. It's that the mode of questioning is the way to sort of start to come to terms with reality. The questions are: where in your life or your work are you currently pursuing comfort when what's called for is a little discomfort? Number 2, are you holding yourself to and judging yourself by standards of productivity or performance that are impossible to meet? Number 3, in what ways have you yet to accept the fact that you are who you are, not the person you think you ought to be? Number 4, in which areas of life are you still holding back until you feel like you know what you're doing? And number 5, how would you spend your days differently if you didn't care so much about seeing your actions reach fruition?
I'll tell you, the one that really rang for me was number 4. Where are you waiting until you know what you're doing? I could really relate to that.
It picks up on a very short blog post I wrote a long time ago about the idea that sort of everyone is winging it all the time, to which I've had more sort of more people relating, I think, than anything else I've ever written. And it's not just because the world is complicated or because we have a lot of issues with self-esteem. Or it is this fact, to bring it back to time, I think, that like we're all of us on the leading edge of the moment going into the future. Absolutely nobody is in a different position than that. So life is improvisation by definition for literally everybody. And the only reason that you only hear you're in a monologue of self-doubt is because you can't hear other people's inner monologues, not because they don't have them. Or, well, some people don't have them, but they're probably the ones who ought to have them.
Yes. No, that there's research about that, actually, which is imposter syndrome, which is a topic I'd like to cover one day on the podcast. Generally only happens among the competent.
Yeah. That question called up a memory. I live on Cape Cod now, and as a teenager, I had the opportunity to come to Cape Cod where I'd never been and would have loved to have gone to waitress for the summer. I was in high school, and I turned it down because I didn't know how to waitress. And I thought I somehow should know how to waitress, never having done it. And I sometimes think about what might have been and what could have been if I had just done this improv of, well, I'll show up and figure it out, or they'll help me, or something. Maybe it has served a purpose, and at least in later life, of figuring it out as you go along, and that it's improv. A lot of life is improv. The question that lit up for me was number 3, of accepting who you are rather than the person that you think you ought to be. And you have quite a bit in the book about this. It's not about serving some, grand ulterior purpose. We have one life here, and the universe doesn't care about whether you come up with some grand invention or whatever other grand achievement we may think will make a difference. Be who you are. Make a friend. Plant a garden. Do what you can.
Beautiful, yes. And to bring it to that idea of not trying to do things that are systematically impossible, I think that connects to this notion that, we have this tiny amount of time. The universe is vast and extends infinitely in time and space around us. If you're only going to accept definitions of a life well spent that put a dent in the universe, to quote Steve Jobs, or that are intrinsically extraordinary and will cause you to be remembered for a very long time. If that's where you set the bar, then you're ruling out all sorts of things that quite open to being extremely meaningful ways to spend your life, or that you may already be doing with your life, on the grounds that there's a certain kind of significance that you need to attain. And we have a problem with how we receive these messages in the culture, because by definition, the more famous somebody is, the more they are, and therefore acting as a role model, the more they are probably going to be caught up in that notion that extraordinariness counts for something. And then, clearly people like who should think about myself and be introspective here, who are not famous but clearly do want some kind of a public profile, probably are a little bit less deluded but still deluded. And then possibly the most enlightened people on the planet are those we don't hear from, because they're just busy doing their meaningful things.
I had a mentor who used to encourage us to dare to be ordinary. And I always liked the juxtaposition of those two things, that it was such a radical daring to be ordinary. And ultimately, we really all are.
Oliver, I'd like to just pivot for a moment into your experience of writing the book, just the process and the time that went into it. What is one thing about writing this book that might surprise people to know it, or perhaps surprised you?
I think that people probably assume, and I think I probably assume when I read other books, that what happens is that people, or certainly books in this broad sort of genre, people grasp something about life somewhat well as a result of their experiences, and then they set it down in a book. And I had the very strange experience over the too many years that it took to write this book of sort of having to change to become a little bit more, certainly not perfectly, the person who could convey the perspective I want to convey in the book. That I must have begun with some very fleeting kind of intellectual grip on the idea of what needed to be said here, but I had to sort of live my way into it in order to write it in an authentic way. And so I always forget that this is the way it went, but actually I had made the initial agreement, the contract to write this book about these ideas prior to becoming a parent, prior to, our son is 4 now, which gives you a sense of the number of years it has taken, although becoming a parent will also get in the way of writing books. That's a slightly separate temporal consideration. And in some other sort of harder to specify ways, I think, sort of prior to sort of becoming more and more fully committed to my life here, this, as opposed to other theoretical ones. And so that's the really weird thing. It's like something in me knew this idea, but I could not write this book sort of properly until I had changed with it. And I suspect that's more common than we think, because we assume people have an idea and then after that they set it down.
So the book kind of wrote you.
Yeah, I got to say, there's something, yes, I think that's right, yeah.
And if I were to just toss out another question that's been brewing in the back of my mind, I'm imagining you've talked to any number of people about the book. What's a question that you wish somebody had asked about this book, but nobody has thought to ask yet?
I mean, I suppose I can say that the questions one doesn't get asked so much, the sort of field of questions that you have a bit today. So thank you. But they are these personal ones about sort of where it comes from in me and my life, because I think there's definitely a sort of self-deprecating / British side of me that doesn't want to go into that. I think there's definitely, it's not like I'm writing about some incredibly lurid headline-grabbing personal disaster that befell me and caused me to have these insights. But I do enjoy very much, hopefully not just for narcissistic reasons, talking about the sort of dawning experience in my own life through sort of suffering as a result of trying to grapple with these things. And then when people connect to that and you have the sense that they know what you're talking about because they've been through it as well. Actually, now I am thinking of one or two conversations where that has happened. So it's not like they haven't been asking it. But I am definitely uncomfortable with the role of, you've sorted this out, now give us advice, for two different reasons. One is probably that I should take more ownership of the fact that I do have a few things to say and some advice to give. But the other is definitely that I feel like if this isn't universal stuff, then it's nothing. So the idea that I might not be, that anyone might not be struggling with it is absurd. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
One thing that I was feeling when you were talking is this process of suffering relative to writing the book, perhaps publishing it and other things. And I think in my own experience of sufferings, particularly sufferings that I've really gone after, problems that I've really wrestled with, sometimes there is a pivotal moment, that aha moment, where the suffering kind of flips and we can exhale, or we can take the step that was too excruciating to take maybe for years. So I'm wondering if you have a tale of a moment like that might have happened in the writing of the book, the step that you suddenly could take, that you were just roasting in.
I mean, tell me if this fits, but what it actually is making me think of is that the spur to this book becoming finished, and for me sort of really exploring maybe the sort of deepest parts towards the end, was the coronavirus lockdown. Not because I was one of these people who suddenly had so much more time, because that is not what happens when they close the preschools.
Oh my.
And the childminder isn't allowed to visit or anything. And certainly partly out of sort of sheer fear, I was like, are there going to be books in 6 months? I better hurry and finish this and get the money I'm owed for finishing it. I mean, my experience of that sort of lockdown was that for a few weeks I was incredibly sort of physically anxious. But as it began to unfold and every piece of news that came in, no matter how terrible, was actually sort of finite, and I was somehow able to get my head around it, I realized what a sense of apocalypse I must have been carrying around in me all the time prior to that. Obviously, this is a hard thing to hear for someone who has sort of lost people close to them through COVID. But like, there was something about like, okay, now we're in this thing that you sort of go around fantasizing about, and it's in a negative way. I mean, and it's so much more sort of possible to come to grips with things that are happening instead of things that might happen next.
It's almost relieving when the worst thing happens.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because however bad it is finite. It is by definition not sort of infinite apocalypse. And that, for me, that's the reason anyway. And something about that was definitely connected to like, okay, just, go ahead and write these ideas and articulate them as well as you're able and finish the thing. So it was hooked up to events in the world.
I really have appreciated your book so much, particularly as just a call to all kinds of awarenesses. And over, as I read the book, things just sort of just went right in and really facilitated a resonance. And they're like, yeah, that's it. Okay, yeah, that registers too. And I'm holding a new kind of awareness of the pungency and the immediacy of kind of really stepping back and looking and considering, what's important, what matters, and the invitation to come into one's own reality.
Well, it just means an enormous amount to me. I mean, it's what I hope to do in it, and it's what I need to do for myself as well. So,
and probably we all do always. This life thing is never a done deal.
I'm circling around that term apocalypse, which I think we've talked about before on the podcast, but that the word apocalypse actually means revelation. And so when I think about the archetype of the apocalypse, that what rose in you was this determination to be revealed. Because I think a book is a way of being revealed.
Yeah, that resonates with me, certainly.
I'm also thinking in terms of all of this time-limited dynamic we're talking about, that there's something about legacy. When you're talking about having a 4-year-old child being revealed, bringing something forward which may have been shy or painful to bring forward, it also has this quality of something that will survive you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel split on that topic because I don't want that to be the measure of whether it's worth doing something like writing a book or even, being present for an afternoon of parenting. I don't want it to all be future focused. And that's not exactly what you're saying, but it's definitely there too. I mean, maybe it feels a bit more spatial to me. It's a bit more about spreading something than it is about lasting longer. An experience I had with my last book that, if I talk about another context, sounds like some weird kind of bragging, but I feel like it might resonate here, is just that you hear from people, when you write about these kinds of ideas, you hear from people who have been helped by them through the kinds of crises that I'm fairly confident I would not be able to handle and would totally go to pieces over and would be a total disaster. And it's just speaks to something in the power of communicating these very old insights in a way that resonates for people. I'm always kind of freaked out by the way that I've apparently been the conduit for something. It does not mean that I could have gone through what they've gone through with 1% of the equanimity.
You used a beautiful metaphor at some point, and I was just looking to see if I could find it, but I couldn't land right on it. But in this thing that you were just talking about, are we working to leave something behind? Are we concerned with legacy? Or but then then are we back in that thing that at the present moment is just, we're sort of just deferring its value or predicating its value on something that's going to happen in the future. You use this metaphor of sort of building a cathedral. And that if you're using your time well, we're all maybe just laying down a brick.
I grew up in York in the north of England, which is the home to York Minster, one of the great cathedrals of England. And I remember reading somewhere about how many of the stonemasons who worked on that, like what that would have actually felt like relative to the completion of it, right? Because these things take decades and centuries to rise, and you don't want to carry a sense of meaning in life that requires you to be there for the opening ceremony at the end of the multi-hundred-year process.
Well, and perhaps that's a place to end and for us to transition over into a dream. So, Oliver, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation for me too. Thank you so much.
Hey, Lisa, what's been going on about your book?
Well, it was released on May 25th, and sales have been strong. And I've been receiving so many lovely emails and texts and phone calls from friends and from people that I don't know, telling me how much they've enjoyed the book. And so that feels really great. The reviews on Amazon have all been glowing, and that's been really heartening. It's just really wonderful to know that this project of mine is resonating with so many people.
I'm just so happy for you, and it's such a lovely, lovely book, both deep and accessible, about the inner journey around being a mother. That's never been written about. It hasn't been out there. And that it's getting such an enthusiastic, heartfelt reception. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I would love it if listeners who've read the book could write a review on Amazon, because although there are many wonderful ones there, more is always better. So thanks in advance for that.
You've really incarnated something that was in the ethers, but needed to be pulled down, needed to be shaped in words, and needed to be made accessible. And proof in the pudding is that it's beginning to have a kind of life of its own in the collective.
Yes.
That speaks a lot to the timeliness of this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joseph.
The analogy to a baby is just too rich and too good and too multifaceted to be missed. It's having a life of its own, which is just what we want.
That's right.
Our dreamer today is a 39-year-old woman, and she's a counselor for children and young people. And here's the dream. I had a dream about a close friend. She had committed a murder, and there was a police detective asking her questions. She had some sort of tracker device that she was holding in her hand most of the dream. She lied to the detective and said she only had it because of her work, and she hadn't even turned it on yet. The policeman wanted to check her tracker to confirm she wasn't at the scene of the murder. She kept making up excuses as to why she couldn't give it to him. She kept coming and going in her car from this house that we were in sometimes with the policeman. Other times it was just busy with different unknown people. My friend was terrified and turned to me for help. At one point, she was wailing and pleading with me to help her and saying, "Please don't let them take me away." I was holding her and comforting her and saying I wouldn't let them do that. Now, for context, she adds, I'm currently moving with my partner and 2 young children back to my home city after 20 years of living away. My friend, who I dreamed about, has been having IVF, fertility treatments, and has found out she's pregnant. She's spoken to me throughout it all about her fears and difficulties and hopes. She says the main feelings in the dream were protection and love and fear. And for additional context, she adds that her friend is a social worker, was not actually a suspect yet in the dream. The detective was eliminating her from inquiries because she's a social worker, and there was an assumed innocence like, oh, of course you didn't do it. Until I hugged my friend, I was observing the actions of the dream and felt quite calm. It's interesting that the context says the detective was eliminating her as a suspect because she's a social worker, but the dream says that this friend had committed a murder. She was guilty.
This dream caught my attention because I used to frequently have dreams earlier in adulthood where I killed someone and then was having to come to terms with the fact that I would be a fugitive for the rest of my life or some such thing. And I always awoke with great relief that I hadn't actually committed a murder. But here it is. So I think we're in the realm of shadow, and that really fits, right? Because the social worker, the person who's a helper, who's a do-gooder, has done this terrible thing, this unspeakable thing.
And she lies. So she commits murder, then understandably enough from a real-world perspective. She lies and denies it, makes excuses, and then finally this shadow figure to the dreamer is terrified and turns to the dream ego for help. And the dream ego is willing to give the help. So we have a really wonderful depiction here of the difference between a dream ego's perspective and what the unconscious might be saying.
The dream reminds me a great deal of this story by Joseph Conrad called The Secret Sharer, which Hollis, I believe, talks about that story in one of his books. It's a perfect depiction of shadow dynamics. There's a captain on a ship, and the story opens with he's on deck late at night, no one else is around, and a man swims up to the boat and climbs on board, and he looks strikingly like the captain. So the captain hides him and learns his story that he was on another ship where there was just a gross abuse of power, and the ship was going to be brought to ruin unless the captain was taken down. And so the man, the kind of doppelganger figure, murdered the captain on the other ship. I hope I'm not getting the details wrong. And then escaped as a fugitive. And the captain who narrates the story, who's the focus of the story, takes him in and protects him and makes sure that he gets away, in fact. So it's the way that the shadow part of our personality can do the dirty deed that ego wouldn't do. It's like Murray Stein says this in Map of the Soul, that the shadow is kind of like the CIA that does these covert operations that the ego wants to disavow and say, oh, no, I'm not like that. But sometimes we have to do the dirty deed. Sometimes we have to commit the murder. And thank goodness there's a shadow part of us that can carry that energy. So there's something positive, I think, about the relationship between the ego and the friend, that the ego can shelter her in her time of guilt.
So the unconscious seems to be saying that it will accept this shadow figure with the shadowy deeds of the murder and the lying and the cover-up. Whereas from a dream ego perspective, it's like, oh my gosh, what? That's terrible.
Well, no, because the dream ego is saying, I'm not going to let them take you away.
Right.
So actually,
exactly.
Yeah.
And accepts the shadow figure like the captain in The Secret Sharer accepted the doppelganger, and accepts the part of her depicted as the friend that has homicidal feelings, wants to escape the law, can lie and deny.
So I would be curious, if we had this dreamer here, to find out who did the friend kill and what was the motive for the murder, and what does she even imagine about that if she doesn't know?
There's something about the dream that just feels confusing to me. It's hard for me to get my hands on it. It's like a slippery eel. What I'm trying to do is step way back from the details and just imagine, perhaps in a more psychological way, is it possible that what she's dreaming about is the death of her independence? It's not uncommon for someone to work very, very hard to get pregnant. And part of being pregnant is that your life is in a way no longer your own. There's a tremendous sacrifice of independence, a sacrifice of resources and priorities, all kinds of things shift implicitly and explicitly. The tracking device, for some reason, reminds me of all the tracking that one has to do to determine if one is pregnant and whether there's a kind of hormonal optimization period. There's a lot of policing of what's going on in the body and the hormone system. And this fear of not being, not wanting to have your old life taken away or assumed by this deed that she has done. And I think the deed is getting pregnant with such determination, which IVF requires, of course, tremendous determination. So I think the dream is suggesting a shadow side of her friend, which is not being spoken of, but might be in the atmosphere, which is a tremendous ambivalence that the friend could be carrying, and asking her to carry it with her on an unconscious level. The dream maker wants it to be spoken about. And perhaps, as I said, the frightening loss is all of the implications about suddenly achieving this pregnancy that she's worked so hard for.
So you think this is a dream about the friend in real life?
It is possible that it is an unconscious dimension of the friend's psychology. I could also imagine a parallel process that as she's moving with her partner and her two children back to the home city after 20 years,
yes,
that she might also be fearing that something inside of herself has been killed off, that a murder has been committed. For some reason, I want to keep going back to this idea of the murdering of independence or autonomy. And whether that's being back in the orbit of the family complex, because you're moving back to the hometown, or literally just the profound changes that happen during pregnancy. I find my imagination wanting to dance around that.
Well, I like your idea that in some sense it's autonomy, which can be imaged as a pregnancy, and heaven knows your autonomy is over there forever after, and the moving back to the home city, and whether something, what has had to be killed off in order to live into this new possibility.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes in dreams, a death of whatever kind, although it's, often in dreams, it's like, oh no, someone died, or oh no, I killed someone. But then the question is, well, what needs to die in the psyche? And, maybe it's just my own prejudice because I've had so many dreams that in some ways are similar to this. And of course, I'm a social worker. But one of the things that comes up for me is, sometimes what needs to die is the tendency to be too nice, to be too much of a helper, to be too giving. That's also a possibility, a possible meaning in the dream, that this friend may be caught in a kind of helper complex that needs to be killed off. And perhaps the dreamer has that aspect in her as well. We don't know. We're just speculating. But it does take some kind of aggression to free oneself from that, just as it takes a kind of aggression to pursue IVF, as you mentioned, Joseph, or maybe to make this kind of move. Or perhaps if one is moving back to one's home city, one needs to marshal that in order to avoid being kind of subsumed by the family complex. Or there are many reasons that I can just fantasize about why there might need to some nice social worker part might need to turn into a vigilante.
When I lean into that phrase, please don't let them take me away. Don't let them take me away. And then I'm just imagining all the possible things that might be threatening to take the dreamer away against her will. We don't know the conditions under which she's moving back to the home city, and it may feel like an abduction of some kind, or something that's not quite 100% aligned in the personality. And again, as we said, with the friend getting IVF, we don't know all the multiple stakeholders in the pregnancy and the pressures to get pregnant and get pregnant in a particular fashion. But there is this voice again of, please don't let something happen, a repercussion happen.
Well, and I'm not sure if I heard this, Joseph, maybe you already said this, but also don't let them take me away. So this part of the dreamer that's able to commit a murder, don't let them take me away. This your kind of aggressive capacity.
The police would lock it up, ostensibly.
Mm-hmm.
What this lifts up is imaged as the friend, but the fear of loss of self, of being trapped in some way. imprisoned.
Yes. And I wonder, we keep on sort of coming back to that in a way. And I wonder if there's some parallel between the friend getting pregnant and the dreamer moving back home. That and does in some way, does that feel like an imprisonment?
Exactly. This fear of imprisonment for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
Would be something at least to ask about, to ponder.
Mm-hmm.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.